The worst roommate of my life. My name is Geeta, I'm 23 years old, and I'd like to tell you something that happened to me. Let me give you some context. It was in Hong Kong in 2020, when I was on a 6-month internship. You should know that life in Hong Kong is relatively expensive, especially regarding rent, so I lived in a shared apartment with 3 other people in an apartment of about 40 square meters. My bedroom was in the center of the apartment, adjacent to the bathroom on one side and a small living room on the other, where my roommates had to pass to access their rooms. The door to my bedroom only locked from the inside, not from the outside. Since the apartment was really small, we could hear everyone coming and going, especially since the door had to be slammed to close it. Concerning my story, I only lived with girls who had become my friends. But at the beginning of August 2020, they left for France, so there were 2 rooms free, and there was only me and another girl left. One day, our landlord announced to us that a boy was going to move into the apartment at the beginning of August. Knowing that I was returning to France around August 23rd, I didn't necessarily want to make a new friend. I was quite indifferent. The day he arrived, I was alone in my room and he came to knock on my door. I opened the door and he wanted to chat to get to know each other. Even if I wasn't necessarily in the mood to be sociable, I couldn't see myself refusing. We started to discuss trivial things like studies, where we come from, what we do in Hong Kong. Until the moment when he asked me if I had a boyfriend, I answered no. At that point, he started to get insistent, asking, "Are you sure you don't have a boyfriend? You don't have a boyfriend in France? So you have a girlfriend? It's weird that you're single." I felt pretty uncomfortable, so I told him I was tired and went back to my room. One weekday evening, I got home from work around 8 p.m., slammed the door as usual, and sat down on the small sofa. Once I was seated, I saw my roommate come out of his room completely naked. I was lucky because there was a rack of jackets to hide his private parts. I found it really strange because you could hear it as soon as someone came in, and you don't walk around naked when you have roommates you don't know. When he saw me, he went back to his room, and I went to the kitchen to make myself dinner. Once in the kitchen and while cooking, he comes to join me in his underwear. He says to me, "Hello, how was your day?" I respond quite coldly. He takes an apple, bounces it with his hand while staring at me for about 40 seconds, and says to me, "Are you scared when I am staring at you like that?" I was super uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say. I must have mumbled something. The kitchen being narrow, he rubs himself against me to access the sink. He washes his apple and goes back to his room. I really found this behavior very strange, so I hurried to cook and locked myself in my room. He always had a very disturbing facial expression, like a forced smile and a very monotonous voice. Over the next few weeks, he regularly came knocking on my bedroom door quite late, around 11 p.m., midnight. When I answered to see what he wanted, he would simply say, "I just wanted to know if you were there," and leave. Until I left, I tried to avoid him as much as possible because he didn't make me feel very comfortable. The day before I left for France, I had some errands to run, and I wanted to pack my suitcase because I was going to spend my departure day with my family before my flight. I was alone with him that day. Since he was in the living room, I asked him to help me close my suitcase, so he stayed with me while I packed my things. I grabbed a product and said it was disinfectant alcohol. He told me it wasn't, so I reiterated that it was. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm violently with an angry expression and poured the entire bottle down my arm. Too strange. He regained his usual expression and said, "Oh yes, indeed, it's alcohol." Once again, I finished what I had to do and left the apartment because he was making me very uncomfortable. On August 23rd, the day I was leaving, I had one last errand to run before joining my family and finally going to the airport. In the morning, I was woken up by noises in the apartment. I heard that he was the one up because my other roommate had come home late from the party. She usually slept until noon, and it was around 8 o'clock. The nightmare began. He sat down on the sofa in the small living room next to my bedroom and began touching himself inappropriately. The walls were thin, so I could really hear everything. He gets up and goes to the bathroom, takes toilet paper, and I hear him stand in front of my bedroom door. In between, I just had the reflex to lock my room. He continued engaging in inappropriate behavior in front of my room for a while. I was disgusted. I didn't know what to do, if I should go out, but I didn't want to see that, and I was afraid he would hurt me. I just waited, crying and lying still in my bed. Finally, I hear him go back to his room. I wait about 30 minutes before leaving my room because I was afraid of running into him. I decide to leave the room, get ready, and leave. Before leaving, I run into my other roommate. Even though we were more friends and not on good terms, I preferred to tell her what had happened, so that she would always lock her room and be very careful with this guy. She told me that she had offered to spend the day with him and her friends. After that day, he harassed one of the girls with messages for several days. After that, I left the apartment and warned the landlord about this guy's actions, but he didn't care. He sent me a message that day on WhatsApp saying, "Have a good trip, Inez. I hope to see you again soon." This whole thing really traumatized me. Not feeling safe in your own home is very disturbing. Since then, noises like water running in the shower, my cat's footsteps on the floor, rain on the window. All of these things wake me up in a panic and with a start. I also wonder what he was doing when he knocked on my bedroom door and I wasn't there. That's my story. From that day on, I never wanted to share an apartment again. A true story, my greatest fear, never again. Good evening, my name is Julianne, and I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me when I lived in my hometown. I worked in a bookstore, only coming in for 5 hours a day, every other week. For everything else, it was 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. One day, I was walking down the street on my way to work when I ran into a homeless man reading a newspaper. It was very worn and torn all over. I gave him some change and told him I hoped he was planning to buy a book in much better condition, and he replied that he would do it just for me. I didn't pay attention to his remark because I was late. At that moment, I should have noticed. I arrive at work, drop off my things, and start filing important documents, etc. I left work around 2:30 p.m. to go home to work. I passed by that same street and ran into the homeless man again, reading a book. It wasn't a long novel, so I figured that since I'd given him some change, he'd had time to finish the story. I asked him if that was the case, and he replied yes, smiling at me and telling me it was one of the best stories he'd ever read. I want to warn you that I have a kind of tic. Every time someone tells me something, I need to check if it's true, but really right now. So I started asking him questions about the story, and I could see he couldn't answer. He told me he was having trouble reading since it had been a while. After that, I went home and thought about what he'd said all night, which unfortunately gave me an idea. The next day, I ran into him again and invited him to come to the bookstore with me so he could educate himself and learn to read properly. He accepted and told me word for word. "Thank you. No one has ever been so kind to me. You're truly a wonderful person, Julianne." At that moment, I froze. How did he know my name when I'd never given it to him? I then pulled myself together, thinking that I must have given it to him earlier without realizing it. We arrived at the bookstore and I left him alone while I worked. After only an hour of work, a colleague called me and told me there was an old man looking for me. I went to see him and asked him what he wanted. He told me he was finished and that he knew how to read properly. He then offered to come home with me so he could read me a book. I flatly refused, telling myself that it was all very strange and a bit on my guard. At this point, he seemed a little upset, but then told me he was going for a walk outside. After 30 minutes, I go to see what he's doing and I see him getting out of an old car. From a distance, I can see through the window that the inside is dusty and there are some sort of small, square-cut, slightly dark sheets of paper on the seat. I don't pay attention just because he has a car, even though he's homeless. I get into the bookstore before him and I see him go behind a small bookcase. I'm picking up some booklets and some documents when I look up and see what? The homeless guy with a camera pointing at me. The guy is calmly taking my picture. He catches my eye and turns the camera to pretend he's taking a picture of the place. I go over to him and tell him I'm going home and that he can stay here until closing time. I get home, I finish writing a few things, and I go to my room to go to bed. I fall asleep but wake up sweating and feel like I heard someone knocking on my door. I try to get him back to sleep, but I start to hear noises like someone is whispering. I realize the sounds are coming from next to my door, so I go over to it and focus on what the whispers are saying. At that moment, I immediately recognize the homeless man's voice and realize that he's been reading me a story the whole time. I run to the bathroom and call the police. I explain the situation and they tell me they'll be there in 15 to 20 minutes. I come out of the bathroom to wait in my room, and that's when I start to hear different noises, like something metal was sliding along the door. I didn't understand what the guy was doing, and I stood by the door until suddenly I heard loud banging on the door, followed by the guy yelling. He was yelling, "They lived happily and had many children," over and over again. I felt like he would never stop. I ran off and locked myself in my room. About 20 minutes later, the police arrived and I heard people yelling, "Police, hands up!" and moaning. Then the police told me they were there and that everything was fine, that they had taken the old man away. I opened the door and they told me they would call me back if there was any news. 2 days later, they called me back and guess what? The old man wasn't homeless. He had been following me for much longer than I thought. The day he was in front of my house, he had brought a knife, but not a normal knife, a butcher knife. They searched his car and found photos of me, a roll of tape, a string, as well as a notebook where he had written down my address and some kind of plan to catch me. Beware of appearances. Was I almost kidnapped? This happened to me 2 weeks ago. I'm a 20-year-old woman and I work at a high school in a part of my town known for its problems. Crime, street harassment, drugs, etc. I've been working at this school for 5 months, and I've never had any real problems with the people I've encountered until March 25th. It's 4:30 p.m. and I'm leaving work. I'm walking towards the bus stop to meet a friend in a park on the other side of town. Once outside, I light a well-deserved cigarette, and at the same time I notice a car that seems to be driving very slowly, but I don't pay it any further attention. I often tend to go into heightened surveillance mode as soon as I step out onto the street, because I've often had some rather unsavory encounters. I'm coming around the bend in the street, and I have to go left to get to the stop sign, which is 180 meters away from where I am at the moment. And just as I'm about to turn, the car that was moving slowly stops. It's no surprise, as there's a yield sign at that point. A second later, I hear the man behind the wheel roll down his window and call out to me in English saying hello or sorry. I'm usually suspicious, but the fact that he's speaking English makes me think he might not be from around here and is looking for directions. So I approach his window and start asking him what he wants. He directly asks me in slightly broken French, "Can I have your number?" I politely tell him that it won't be possible. He asks me why, and I then tell him that I don't want to and that I won't give it to him, just because he asks for it. I'm a little pissed off because I see he's forcing it. I quickly look at his car to see inside, but I can't see anything in the back because the windows are tinted. The guy asks me, "Is it possible to smoke a joint with you?" I always tell him no, it won't be possible, and I say goodbye to mark the end of the conversation. He then says, "Wait, is it possible to be with you like that?" with a sly smile. At that moment, my blood boiled. It was too much for me. I almost yell at him, "Who do you think you are? Get out of here, get lost." The car moved a little further along the yield sign so that the back door was in front of me. Suddenly, a man who was hiding in the back opened it and grabbed my arm to pull me back into the car. Without thinking, I threw my entire body weight against the door to close it, and it worked. So I ran toward the bus shelter. You should know that during this whole scene, people are in the street, and everyone is watching without coming to help me. The car follows me down the street I'm on, and the guy continues to call me and signal. I yell in the street, telling him to get lost. I arrive at the stop, and a man with a daughter about 6 years old is sitting there. The girl's father asks me why I'm yelling like that and tells me I scared his daughter. I explain and apologize for scaring his daughter, except that this guy's car is still there at the red light just after I stop. And from that red light, he can turn around and come back for me whenever he wants. I told the man and pointed at the car. A bus other than mine arrived, and the man got on with his daughter and wished me a good day. My bus was in 10 minutes, so I told myself I couldn't stay there. I also thought about all the students at the school who were away on the weekend and who would all want to go home. I told myself I wasn't the only one in danger, and it was extremely strange for something like this to happen right at the school exit. So I ran to the school and rang the doorbell to let them in. I called 2 of my colleagues and told them everything. I waited 20 minutes inside the school before leaving, escorted by one of my colleagues. I warned my friend and my parents, and I went to the park afterward as planned, then to my birthday party that evening. It's been 2 weeks now, and I realize it's affected me more than I thought. I have nightmares about it. I have trouble going to work even though I love it, anxiety attacks, and so on. I constantly stare at cars when I leave work. I went to the police station as soon as possible, but they told me my testimony wasn't enough to file a complaint because I didn't have the license plate, and I left the station after being asked what I was wearing during the attack. The school was able to report the incident to the police, and that's the end of the story. The Fake Forest Ranger. My story began in February 2021 and just ended, early June 2021. My house, where I still live, is quite isolated. To get there, you have to take a small path that has just been paved. I remember one Friday in November. It was in the afternoon. I was watching TV and I heard someone knocking on the door. He said he was the forest ranger and that he had come to see me to get my approval for cutting down a tree half on my land and half on the city forest. So I opened the door. I wasn't worried at all. The man seemed normal. He came into my house, made me sign some papers, and he was thirsty, so I served him a drink. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night from a nightmare. Right after, I heard a boom, like someone or something was falling out of my window. This noise will be explained at the end of this post. No spoilers. I wondered what it was, but I couldn't be bothered getting out of bed, so I rationalized it by telling myself it must have been an animal or an object. After that day, I felt like someone was putting my clothes on, especially my underwear. The ends of my comforter were tucked under the mattress, and I never make my bed like that. I was pretty sure someone came into my house during the day. I even started to think this person was watching me sleep. I felt like I could sense a presence. But I had just lost my mother, so I thought I was suffering from some kind of depression, paranoia, and was imagining a presence. Also, I closed all the windows, and there was no sign of a break-in. I'd been feeling this way for 2 weeks, so I wanted to check if I was crazy or not. So a friend who works from home moved in with me. The first night after moving in, he told me that around 10 a.m., he'd heard footsteps in the garden and even seen a shadow. We were really starting to get scared. I was starting to suspect that the person breaking into my house might be the forest ranger. Besides, it had been 2 months since he'd visited me, and the tree he'd told me about still hadn't been cut down. Without a second thought, I decided to go talk to the town hall about this tree issue. When I got there, no one had heard of my tree. Everything was getting weird, so I asked to see the village ranger. I'd been waiting for half an hour when a man entered the town hall. He introduced himself, and he looked nothing like the ranger who had come to my house 2 months earlier. Leaving the town hall, I went straight to the police station and called my friend who was at my house. I told him to leave immediately and meet me at the police station, because he was in danger at my house. 15 minutes after my friend arrived, the police were on their way to my house. When they arrived, they saw the fake ranger get out and flee on foot, and they finally caught him. It turned out this man had escaped from a prison about 20 kilometers from my house. He had a criminal record for 3 counts of deliberately taking lives and for identity theft. The police told me he got rid of his 2 former roommates by making them believe he was one of their old acquaintances, someone he had also taken out. He received a 30-year sentence, the maximum sentence. Since his escape, he had been sleeping under trees in the forest. The thing is, he had escaped a month before meeting me, so I think he was watching me to know when I left home and when I came back, so he could leave without getting caught. I think he chose my house and not one closer to the prison he escaped from, because he didn't want to get caught, and my house was very isolated. So he was the one who fell out of my window and made a boom. Plus, I noticed that it was easy to climb through my bedroom window. 2 days ago, I realized I was missing a key to my house, so that's how he got into my house. Since all my keys are on display in the living room, he must have taken a spare when he made me sign the fake papers to cut down the tree. Since then, I've installed 8 cameras. It cost me a fortune. If this story gave you chills, there's more where that came from. I share true unsettling stories just like this one. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss the next descent into the unknown. Check out my other videos, they're waiting for you. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next one.